Hey, mate, 40 here. Got up at 4 a.m. and spent 4 hours cutting, editing, and uploading various shorts from the terrific show we did last night. I took my Adderall at 4 a.m. and then I forgot to take it after that. So I'm just on one Adderall, one 10 milligram tablet of Adderall that I took at 4 a.m. 13 hours ago, but I'm going to do the best I can. Yeah, very serious story. New sexually transmitted fungal infection detected in New York City, the first case in the United States. And apparently men who have sex with men are the most at risk. But let's not be homophobic about this, right? This could just happen to anyone. This is just purely an accident. Who knows what's really going on here? All right. Case. Health experts warning of a new and highly contagious virus after New York City man develops a sexually on the rise in Europe, especially in men who have sex with men. So if you're having sex with men, be on the lookout, right? This bloke developed a rash on his penis, buttocks, and limbs after having sex with men while traveling to England and Greece. Right after having some Greek love. Luckily, it responds to standard antifungal therapies, but you can't be too careful. Right? Have you guys read this book by Dr. Tim Dean, Unlimited Intimacy?
To the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, the summer season. I was joking with my guest here that I now have changed my Zoom name to Doctor, but we'll see. I'm relishing changing all my social media accounts to Doctor, and then eventually
Powerful.
I'll let it, the moment will pass, but I'm going to soak as much juice out of this as I can. But I want to introduce a really special guest, someone who I've known since I was an undergrad in terms of work, not in terms of actually talking with him. So it really is a beautiful manifestation that he's joined here in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room with me. I'm joined with Dr. Tim Dean, who's a British philosopher, author. He is all things queer theory and literary theory. He is the James M. Benson Professor in English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is the author of Unlimited Intimacy, Reflections on the Subculture of Barebacking, Beyond Sexuality. Recently, he published The Hatred of Sex with Oliver Davis. He also did a Walt Whitman poetic article that is in my dissertation. And he also contributed to Homosexuality and Psychoanalysis, which is staring at me because I have all of his books in front of me. Well, Tim, without further ado, thank you so much for joining me here. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to talking with you.
Yeah, well, right away, I mean, I'm going to want everyone to be on the edge of their seats for when we discuss barebacking and unlimited intimacy and that 2009 moment. When your work came out, which, to give context, I was in high school. But I do remember seeing that cover and what that was like as an undergrad. But I think even before that, if we can journey back, Tim, on this adventure in the 1990s when you got your PhD, what was it like? I knew you were working on not necessarily queer cultural studies, but it seems like you were really interested in psychoanalysis. Like, how did that first enter?
I was just talking to a philosopher friend, and he said from what he's seen, he'd put the odds of lab leak being the source of COVID at about 90%.
The realm of what you were interested in.
Right. Yeah, I think it's good to give some prehistory to the work that, excuse me, your listeners might be, the work of mine, the listeners might be most familiar with. Yeah, I went to graduate school. I graduated from college in 1988. When you were not even in high school yet, right?
I wasn't alive yet, but
right. I went to graduate school. I graduated and went to graduate school in 1988, and queer theory did not exist at that point, right? It was something we were at the end of the 80s, start of the 90s, starting to invent.
Pretty shocking that queer theory apparently does not protect against STDs. I would have thought that it would be more.
Hi, this is Yona again. I wanted to make another video about HPV because over the last year I've gotten a lot of questions and realized that there are things that I kind of left open-ended. So one of the major questions that I've gotten over since my last video was just like the timeline, and people wanted to know like how long it's been since I had anything and kind of like how long that process was. So I just want to break down everything that I went through so that the timeline is very clear. So in December of 2017, I had my first outbreak, which was small, but then I got it treated with cryotherapy, and I had like, it kept popping back. So I kept doing these like inpatient surgeries, minor surgeries, where I was like awake and they were just like either freezing or burning it or something. And then in April, so 5 months after my first like outbreak, and after getting like probably 3 or 4 cryotherapy sessions, I had a really intensive cauterization surgery. I had a lot of warts, and it was a really intense process and a lot of recovery. There's a video on that if you want to learn more about it. After that, I was pretty good. I had like a couple of specs over the next couple of months, like every maybe 2 or 3 months, I would get like a little war.
Right, and this could happen to anyone.
Externally, fortunately, which is...
Well, on the other hand, gay men do average over 100 sex partners, right, per person. So that's why so many get nasty diseases.
Able to treat with ACV, apple cider vinegar, or thuja oil or something like that. So that wasn't such a big deal. I didn't have big outbreaks again, but I just kept...
That guy, what a great attitude, right? He just shrugs it off, not a big deal.
Kept checking in, and like as soon as I noticed a weird bump, I would start treating it right away. So
right, we can all learn from this. Like, we all get these weird bumps. Like, we can get them physically, we can get them spiritually, we can get them psychologically, but when you get that weird bump, right, treat it right away, guys.
About a year after that, it was like maybe like in the frame of May to March to May of like 2019, I had 3 little dots inside again, and I wanted to get those taken care of right away because those like internal warts can be they can
internal warts, they're just the worst, guys. You get internal warts, please take care of them right away and learn from this guy. See how socially responsible he is when these internal warts pop up, you know, he zaps them.
Oh, and you need the big surgery again. So I wanted to get those sorted right off the bat. So I went to a new doctor. I had moved to San Francisco, where there was actually a lot better medical care than I had had when I was traveling. And the doctor that I had used trichloroacetic acid. It was like I was able to be awake. It didn't hurt that bad. I mean, it was like a bit of a pinch, but it was fine relative to other stuff that I had done. So it was quite non-invasive relative to everything else that I did.
Great news. Laponia says, I'm here, I'm queer, get used to it.
And I had to go back and do a couple sessions. Like I would come back.
This trichloroacetic acid, man, it's great stuff. It's really good stuff. I can't recommend it strongly enough.
Every week or 2 until they were gone. But that was quite effective, and it was non-invasive, so it was something that I would now recommend a lot. So after doing that a couple of times, it was resolved. I do want to say that the doctor that I went to thought...
Look, this is a safe space, so feel free to share in the chat your own experiences with STDs.
That the...
Stigma is the enemy, all right? It's because of stigma. It drives so many people into even more aberrant and, you know, voracious and promiscuous sexual activity. So if we could just dial back the stigma and instead embrace and accept, you know, radical love and inclusion.
Scar tissue from the surgery that I was at was, or that I had from a different doctor, was warts or something like off. So she wanted to burn that. Actually, she had made plans to schedule me for a surgery. And I was like, okay, before you do this, like I want...
Yeah, so if you get, like, it could happen to anyone. You get these, what you think are like incurable, you know, internal anal warts, and then you have surgery to burn them off, and then it leaves scars. But usually you can get surgery that removes the scars.
want to see it because she didn't really like, you know, that's not normal that they would show you what they're seeing. So I had her like show me with a video, and I realized it was the scar tissue because I had like kind of learned what that looked like through my surgery, and I was like, yo, that's like not anything wrong, it's just like scar tissue. So I called.
Yeah, homophobia is the biggest public health scourge, right? It's not monkeypox, right? It's not all the stuff that the media likes to sensationalize. All right, the biggest public health scourge is ignorance, bigotry, and homophobia.
Called off the surgery, and that didn't grow or anything. But I share that because I want to make the point that it's really important to also, like, don't just give all of the decisions to your doctor. Don't, like...
Think about how brave this man is. Like, so many people, like, stuck, you know, with outdated bourgeois morality, that they'd feel embarrassed to make YouTube videos about, you know, the 58 different things they did to, you know, keep their STDs under control. But this brave young man is showing us a better way to live.
Think that they have like ultimate knowledge. Like, this is something you really have to be conscious of and you have to work with yourself. So be a participant in your healthcare. I think that saved me from a total...
And be an ally to these poor men who are suffering.
Unnecessary surgery that probably would have left me like in bed for weeks, and yeah, it just like it would have made the scarring probably worse. So I mean, it was a good doctor. The trichloroacetic acid was an effective treatment that I would recommend, so I thank her for that. But yeah, doctors can also get stuff wrong, so be cautious. So yeah, I'm gonna make other...
So have you read Dr. Tim Dean's book? Came out in 2009, Unlimited Intimacy. Doesn't that sound awesome? Reflections on the subculture of barebacking. So barebacking, when gay men deliberately abandon condoms and embrace unprotected sex, has incited a great deal of shock, outrage, anger, and even disgust for very little contemplation. Right, purposely flying in the face of decades of safe sex campaigning, boo, and HIV/AIDS awareness initiatives, boo. Right, just all bit, you know, barely disguised homophobia. Barebacking is unquestionably radical behavior that most people would rather condemn than understand. Thus, the time is ripe for unlimited intimacy. Tim Dean's riveting investigation into barebacking and the distinctive subculture that has grown around it. Audacious and undeniably provocative, Dean's profoundly reflective account is neither a manifesto nor an apology. Instead, it is a searching analysis that tests the very limits of the study of sex in the 21st century. Dean's extensive research into the subculture provides a tour of the scene's bars, sex clubs, and websites, offers an explicit but sophisticated analysis of its pornography, and documents his own personal experiences in the culture. But ultimately, it is HIV that animates the controversy around barebacking. An Unlimited Intimacy explores how barebackers think about transmitting the virus, especially the idea that deliberately sharing it establishes a new network of kinship among the infected. Right? This is a whole new level of family that gays are pioneering here. Intimacy, guys, makes us vulnerable. It exposes us to emotional and physical risk. It forces us to drop our psychological barriers. As a committed experiment in intimacy without limits, one that makes those metaphors of intimacy quite literal, barebacking thus says a great deal about how intimacy works. Written with a fierce intelligence and an uncompromising nerve, Unlimited Intimacy will prove to be a milestone in our understanding of sexual behavior.
Other videos explaining some of the other questions that I didn't make answered, but I just wanted to give this timeline of what it was, like what my process was. So the whole thing was a year and a half, but truly it was like 6 months where it was really bad and I needed to be super active and like worrying about treatments all the time. And then it was like a year of just keeping an eye on stuff and doing like touch up little things when something would pop up. That was over a year ago now. So, I mean, I've been over a year without anything. And the ones that I had, like the last ones that I'd had, they were always...
All right, this is a happy ending. All right, this is a story of courage and confronting reality head on. Right, and this is Dr. Tim Dean, the author of this audacious and intelligent book, Unlimited Intimacy.
And I went to graduate school in English to study poetry. and I wrote a dissertation on Hart Crane, although I also did, of course, read Whitman in graduate school and in college, although not in high school. We don't do that in England, right? But I was also very engaged, I was sort of engaged on two fronts in graduate school when I was living in Baltimore, in addition to working on poetry. One was engaged in a kind of intense set of theoretical debates about how to think about sexuality and gender. We had feminism, we had the history of feminist theory and feminist activism, and we had sort of gay studies and gay activism, and we were starting to think more broadly in terms of queer, right? And we were thinking about it both in terms of politics and in terms of conceptualization. And the other thing that was sort of unavoidably
Yeah, pretty shocking that this guy studied poetry.
Pressing itself upon me was that we were still in the first decade of the AIDS epidemic, right? And I had just moved to the United States, to this very urban environment, and I was getting involved in that kind of work. And as a young gay man, I was thinking about, okay, what does this mean for my life, for my sex life, for my community? And that was part of being in Baltimore, not simply being at Johns Hopkins in graduate school. And for me, those two things came together. Thinking about AIDS, thinking about queer, thinking about sexuality, and this is a long way round of talking about psychoanalysis, which I was not actually sure we were going to talk about today.
Wow, who knew he was into psychoanalysis? And
5 days
poetry.
after the World Health Organization declared monkeypox a global health emergency, it has now issued a new warning. According to the World Health Body, men are at higher risk of catching monkeypox if they don't reduce sexual activities. According to the latest WHO report, 98% of the monkeypox cases detected since the outbreaks this time have emerged in May and have been found among gay and bisexual men. Apart from this, the data also highlighted how 95% of the monkeypox cases were found in men who have sex with other men. The WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, has further advised men to limit their sexual partners in order to lower the risk of infection and reduce the spread as well.
That means making safe choices for yourself and others. For men who have sex with men, this includes, for the moment, reducing your number of sexual partners, reconsidering sex with new partners, and exchanging contact details with any new partners to enable follow-up if needed.
Meanwhile, experts have not been able to conclude if monkeypox represents a new type of sexually transmitted infection. However, according to World Health Organization advisor, monkeypox is transmitted during sexual activity.
We have convened a number of STI experts to look into this question. And in short, they've concluded that this is clearly transmitted during sex. And so they're comfortable in describing this as sexually transmitted.
Wow, who would have thought? Okay, so why are gay men at greater risk for HIV?
More at risk for HIV.
You have some questions? We know HIV.
I'm a doctor. I'm trained for this.
We're gonna give you what you need.
The answer to this question is not about who you are, but it's more about a numbers game. Since the HIV epidemic started in the 1980s, gay men have been at a greater risk and represented more of new HIV cases that we've known in this country and actually internationally as well. In this day and time, gay men still make up about 2/3 of the new HIV diagnosis. So whether you like it or not, just because you're having sex with other men, you are going to put yourself in a pool where you're having a greater chance of getting in contact with HIV. The other part of that is that when you do have sex, anal sex in particular, without a condom, it's going to be more at risk for HIV. So again, the point I would want to make, it's not because of who you are. It's not just because you're gay. It's because we live in a high HIV prevalent society among gay men, and then also because some of the behaviors that we engage in may put us more at risk for HIV.
Ask the HIV doc. I didn't really know about the HIV doc. What else we got here? So young men who have sex with men are 44 times more likely to contract HIV. But a new game, the most effective online intervention program yet, developer Northwestern, keep it up, reduce sexually transmitted infections by 40%. What will you have? Will you have a drink? Research shows people
we
are
were
unsure
trying
about
to create
using
a program
condoms.
that would be appealing, that could educate, but would also be engaging, that people would want to do.
7 video modules of soap opera interviews with men.
We were comparing
living
Keep It Up
similar
to just HIV education, essentially PowerPoint slides about HIV.
Keep It Up, first
We were really
online
blown
HIV
away by how
prevention
effective
program.
the intervention was.
Reduced gonorrhea and chlamydia by 40%.
We were going into it expecting maybe we'd see a 10, 15,
by 40% of the population that has the highest rates, gay men, in the U.S.
15% reduction, but 40% is a huge effect.
Wow, it even teaches people how to use a condom. And it weaves HIV
So we don't
prevention.
start by the first thing you see is this is HIV, it's a virus, here's how it's transmitted. We start by hearing stories of other young men.
It's important to me for the people in my life to be fit, you know?
We kept saying, we're not your mother, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to give you the information so that you can choose to protect yourself. And we want to motivate you to protect yourself. But we're not telling you what to do. And I think that really jives well with the idea of these soap operas and these games, because people can engage with it and learn the information, but it's not a lecture. When we asked for feedback at the end of it, one of the participants said that they didn't really understand some of the things they were doing in their own life until they started judging the characters in the soap opera.
Have fun, stay safe.
Okay, I'm
Keep it up.
happy if you're happy. Just as long as you're practicing safe sex. I mean, you are using condoms, aren't you?
Jacob would never do anything to hurt me, Adam.
And then they realized they were actually doing those same things themselves. And so it's a really strong storytelling method that gets people to connect with the characters and then really reflect on their own life and their own behaviors.
Wow, powerful. Okay, this is the new...
These presentations provide short
Superfungal.
discussion of current topics and may be helpful to you and your...
Tried to put the relevant features in there so you wouldn't have to read so much. And my one,
Okay, this is
actually,
the new
what is in the
fungus.
center bottom of the slide. On the left-hand side, you can see the end where it was attached to a hyphal strand because there's a little piece sticking out there. And you look at the opposite end, you see that it's rounded. That is microfied rubrium gets its name. And that's the next slide shows you the red diffusible pigment on the backside.
Right, these are the new...
Takes a little while for this to be produced.
fungal infections.
But this gives you an
threatening gay
idea of
men.
what trichophyte rubrium can do.
Wow.
The next slide presents another organism that we deal with fairly infrequently. It grows up well on mycocell agar. It sporulates better on cormial agar. It produces a lot of microconidia.
Okay, what about STDs? Powerful. Yeah, playing basketball. Oh, God.
Yourself, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I'm not the right person for this. That's something you should look into with a medical professional. Whether that means a legit medical professional in person, like a doctor or nurse or something like that, or if that means like WebMD or another legitimate online source for health. If you live in a big city and there happens to be like a gay health clinic, definitely check out that place. They're gonna have a lot of information about protection and treatment and all that kind of stuff. I'm gonna talk about the STI, STD thing from sort of a different view. Sometimes I've been asked, like, I know you're a bit of a hoe. What about STDs? What about STIs? What about HIV? So I'm just gonna talk about my own personal stance. First of all, I am on PrEP. If you don't know what PrEP is, it stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. In some places, people take PrEP every single day. I do. That's how I've been prescribed it. My doctor says take it every single day. If you miss a dose, it's really no big deal. Just pick up again the next day. Some places in the UK or in Europe actually do like 3 doses a week. I don't know. Again, trust your doctor, your pharmacy, whatever they tell you to do. So I take PrEP every single day. PrEP is not 100% effective. Men have become HIV positive while using PrEP correctly. That is something you have to accept when you take it, and it's the same risk that women take when they take the birth control pill. it's not 100% effective either. You can always still use condoms if you like. In fact, that's probably what your doctor is going to tell you to do. But most people aren't trying to get you off. Most people in your life are not trying to fuck you. I mean, unless it's Dr. Wolf. So they're going to take...
Okay, unlimited intimacy, powerful stuff.
Psychoanalysis was, I came sort of armed with some psychoanalytic readings, knowledge, perspectives. It's sort of part of my worldview, really, which I think has to do with not being American, the different status of psychoanalysis in British intellectual life versus American intellectual life. So I was always interested in, the status of sexuality vis-a-vis the unconscious and the importance of fantasy, and those are concepts and ideas and themes that have stayed sort of either on the surface or subterranean in my work, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure you're aware of, there's the concept of the pre-homosexual in terms of like moving before Foucault or like before Victorian sexology. I mean, I even in my dissertation talk about the pre-homosexual with looking more at Whitman's depictions of same-sex desire between men without using, arguing against using anachronistic, like trying to throw on terms of homosexuality, bisexuality.
So, okay, in other news, I've been listening to The New Yorker. They got a great piece here on the secrets of the Stasi. Okay.
Arab embassies. He wondered if Ganin would like to join him for coffee the next day. Ganin was quite sure that she had never seen the man before in her life. Given her history, there was a good chance that he was an East German spy. She agreed to the meeting without hesitation. Ganin longed to live in East Berlin. She was born in Berlin in 1932, before the city was divided, but was forced to flee with her family at the age of 6. The Ganins were Jewish. One night in 1937, a boarder who was living with Salamiya and her 2 sisters and her mother, her parents were divorced, denounced them to the local police. Salamiya's sister Franziska was sleeping with an Aryan, the boarder said, in violation of race ordinances. Franziska left for Australia 2 weeks later, but the rest of the family had to stay back. Salamiya's father had been imprisoned at Buchenwald as an Arbeitsscheuer Jude, an indolent Jew, after being hospitalized with syphilis. When he was
Wow, they put him in Buchenwald just because he was hospitalized with syphilis. So if you're all stigmatizing and hostile because different groups get STDs, well, you're just being like the Nazis.
Released after the Jewish community helped Salamiya's mother pay 100 marks in bail, he escaped to Shanghai. The rest of the family made their way to Melbourne in May of 1939, 4 months before the war began. Salamiya was a solitary, rootless child. Her mother had never shown much interest in her. She only got pregnant with Salamiya.
Okay, yeah, solitary, rootless. If you've got a huge thirst for meaning, it means something's really wrong in your life, right? You lack normal human connections. So throughout much of my life, I had this huge thirst for meaning. It reflects something, really wrong with my life, a lack of normal human connection. So some people take that huge thirst for meaning, they become communists. Other people become radical alt-right intellectuals. Other people convert to a new religion. But if you're on some radical quest for meaning in your life, that's just an distraction. That's just an externalization of what's going on inside of you, which is a lack of ease with yourself, which inhibits you from having easy relations with other people.
To try to save her marriage, she later admitted, and her mother's boyfriend showed even less. When Salamiya was 11, she was shipped off to a boarding school for 7 months. It wasn't until the following year, when her sister Renya let her tag along to a communist youth group meeting, that Salamiya began to feel at home. The party was anti-fascist, pro-union, and radically egalitarian. Its meetings were fired with optimism and a fierce sense of belonging, everything Salamiya had been missing at home. Soon, she was handing out leaflets and selling copies of Youth Voice in downtown Melbourne, reading Lenin, Marx is too complicated, she was told, and giving speeches on the steps of the Commonwealth Bank. Ganin is a security risk, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation concluded in 1951. It was the first entry in what grew to be a voluminous file. Later reports would describe her as an unscrupulous and a fanatical communist, and her mother and her as a couple of mean, contemptible witches. Ganin was working as a secretary at a government-owned aircraft factory, the first report noted, but that could be easily remedied. Her dismissal should not entail great administrative difficulties. 3 years later, having been sacked from a succession of jobs, Ganin came to a dramatic conclusion. She had been to East Berlin a few years earlier for the World Festival of Youth and Students for Peace and had been exhilarated by the stirring rhetoric she'd heard. This was where she belonged, she thought, at the forefront of the communist struggle, fighting to keep her birthplace free from fascism. On April 15, 1954, she boarded the passenger ship Otranto in Melbourne and returned to the country that had nearly killed her. Or so she hoped. When Ganin arrived in West Berlin and applied for residency in the German Democratic Republic, her request was ignored. The East Germans thought she might be a Western spy. They didn't believe all my enthusiasm, Ganin recalls. The West Germans thought she was spying for the East. Each side sent agents to follow her. At 10 a.m., surveillance was interrupted because two suspicious persons, presumably counter-observers, were in the vicinity. The East German Staatssicherheitsdienst, or Stasi, reported on December 18, 1954. Ganin was 22 years old, her file noted. She had a stocky, powerful build, conspicuously strong haunches, a full, round face, long nose, and dark blonde hair. She wore second-hand clothes, could seem shy and unsettled, and rarely made eye contact. Yet she had a pronounced sex drive and was not averse to men. All of this seems, in retrospect, unremarkable for a woman in her early 20s, alone in a foreign country and well aware that she might be under surveillance. But it worried the Stasi. They gave her the code name Stomper. Ganin spent the next 7 years trying to gain their trust. The way I'm built, the higher the barrier, the more I'm convinced that I belong there, she says. She moved to London for 3 years and joined the British Communist Party. She returned to West Berlin and wrote articles for the Democratic German Report, a socialist...
Okay, so this woman's now in her 80s or 90s, and she recognized that she, wasted her life pursuing radical politics. So someone joins Black Lives Matter, someone joins the alt-right, someone joins communism. All right, they're not joining these radical organizations on the wings of victory. Right? People end up in, these radical groups because their life doesn't work, and they've got this huge thirst for meaning that comes from a lack of normal human connection. Okay, the White House is really, really mad at the Wall Street Journal because the top story in the Wall Street Journal today was about Joe Biden. Behind closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping. Who would have
Behind
thought?
closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping. Participants in meetings said the 81-year-old president performed poorly at times. The White House said Biden is sharp and his critics are playing partisan politics. By Annie Linsky and Siobhan Hughes. June 4, 2024. 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Washington, when President Biden met with congressional leaders in the West Wing in January to negotiate a Ukraine funding deal, he spoke so softly at times that some participants struggled to hear him, according to 5 people familiar with the meeting. He read from notes to make obvious points, paused for extended periods, and sometimes closed his eyes for so long that some in the room wondered whether he had tuned out. In a February one-on-one chat in the Oval Office with House Speaker Mike Johnson, the president said a recent policy change by his administration that jeopardizes some big energy projects was just a study, according to 6 people told at the time about what Johnson said had happened. Johnson worried the president's memory had slipped about the details of his own policy. Last year, when Biden was negotiating with House Republicans to lift the debt ceiling, his demeanor and command of the details seemed to shift from one day to the next, according to then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
Right, you just have to see some video to see that this guy is not really fully there. Politico has an article, Biden's team seized over another age piece and sours on the Journal. So one of the few positive relationships between the West Wing and print media has been put under some strain. For much of Joe Biden's time in office, the White House has held the Wall Street Journal's news operation in high regard, and they appreciated the Journal's unvarnished and dry approach to coverage. They'd grown annoyed at the Washington Post's inclination to run TikTok stories and what they felt was the New York Times' obsession with the subject of the president's age. So why is the White House so sensitive to stories about Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline? For the same reason that everyone gets incredibly sensitive over big discrepancies between their own view of the world and how the world really is. Like, the bigger the gap between reality and your understanding of yourself, the more insecure and sensitive you will be. right? If you can't process reality, if you can't accept reality, the more you have to deny reality, such as the Biden team has to obviously deny reality. The guy is just cognitively slipping, just a feeble old man. And the gap between what the White House puts out with regard to Joe Biden's capabilities and the reality on the ground is so large that it can be measured by the intensity of their reaction. It's imagine that someone came into the chat now and said, I didn't accept, Luke, your conversion to Judaism. Well, if I had a really intense reaction to that, it means that I haven't assimilated reality, that I am not at ease with the topic myself. Now, dozens of people have come into the chat and said things like that, and it means absolutely nothing to me because I've dealt with it. All right, you'll know when I haven't dealt with something when it comes up and it throws me, and I become obsessed about some piece of criticism. So now that I've increased my YouTube views and Facebook views by more than 100 times, I'm getting 100 times as many comments, and I enjoy scrolling through them and getting comments on my videos. But none of them really stick because none of them are bringing up anything that I haven't work through. So that could change right now, right? Laponius may throw down some comment in the chat and it just like completely throws me because it's something that I haven't processed. But if I embrace reality, right, accept reality, then I'm not going to be thrown by this stuff. But the White House relationship with the Wall Street Journal now under serious strain following the journal's own publication of a lengthy story on the president's health and mental acuity. Story casts Joe Biden as discursive, distracted, mumbling, and non-attentive. Says he speaks in hushed tones and stumbles over his own administration policies. Well, that seems pretty obviously correct. I mean, how could anyone even deny that?
The white man has no friends. Anthropology has long viewed non-whites through the eyes of whites, but what about the reverse? How do whites appear when they are the other? Written by Peter Frost. 10 years ago, I contributed to a book on the situation of whites in France. How do they see themselves? How do they experience their increasingly multiracial society? What does it mean to be white? The book seemed to have the aim of giving the Français de souche a voice and bringing them into a dialogue. That aim was not achieved. In the different chapters, whites are presented as objects rather than subjects. They are commented on, but not asked to comment. They are talked about while having no chance to talk. Yes, that is how non-whites used to appear in countless ethnographies and scholarly works, but instead of righting that wrong, this book, like so many others, goes to the other extreme. The perspective is especially unbalanced when whites are victimized as whites. In one chapter, Sadri Chiari argues, quote, "But if one envisages racism as a power relationship, one cannot place on the same level those who benefit from the entire power of the racial system and those who often have only their words to resist. Today, the notion of anti-white racism is being mobilized to delegitimize the anti-racist movement." Chiari, 2013, pp. 45-46. Yet, anti-white racism is not just words, it is also actions. Today, interracial violence skews overwhelmingly in one direction. Why? If whites are so powerful, why do they allow this? The answer should be clear. Insofar as whites have power, they normally use it as individuals to defend individual interests. One has to be naive to think they use it collectively, the poor laborer being in league with the globe-trotting businessman. That claim used to be made by
So in my experience in Australia, United States, white doesn't have resonance with the overwhelming majority of people. Only marginalized losers really resonate with their white identity. If you're building anything in life, let's say you're a successful businessman, then your primary identity in all likelihood is as a businessman or perhaps as an Orthodox Jew or as Baha'i. If you're a great surgeon, all right, your identity is a surgeon. If you love living in New York City or Beverly Hills, then your identity may be geographic, that you live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Very few people in Australia or in the United States have white as their first identity.
Racists about certain groups. It's now the stock in trade of anti-racists. But let's accept the book's underlying premise. We need to reverse the long-standing perspective between observer and observed. Fine. How then do whites appear to others? In what ways do they think and act strangely? And how did they become strange? Finally, how does their strangeness work against them in a post-white world? Whites are too trusting. In one chapter, a contributor with Algerian parents is interviewed about his childhood in Toulouse. Quote, "In the neighborhood, we had a chum who was blonde with blue eyes. He was the son of a working man, of modest background like us, but he seemed perfect to us. Beautiful, blonde, white. We were subordinate to him. Until the moment when someone from our gang came and confronted him. When the blonde got his first punch in the mouth, he was demystified." Cherfi, 2013, p. 61. North African boys like to act collectively, and such action supersedes individual ties of friendship. For French boys, individualism is the norm. No gang comes to their defense when trouble starts. This pattern has been noticed by other non-European observers, like the clinical psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, when describing a case during the Algerian War of Independence.
So I grew up in Australia, I grew up in Anglo-Protestant culture, highly individualist. But when you start living in a multicultural society, you'll often encounter that a group strategy that employs different moral standards for the in-group versus the out-group will often outcompete an individualist strategy that holds to a universal morality.
Quote, "Case no. One murder by two young Algerians 13 and 14 years old of their European playmate. The 13-year-old. We weren't angry with him. Every Thursday, we would go hunting together with slingshots on the hill above the village. He was our good buddy. He no longer went to school because he wanted to become a mason like his father. One day, we decided to kill him because the Europeans wanted to kill all the Arabs. We can't kill the grown-ups. But him, as he was our age, we can. We didn't know how to kill him. We wanted to throw him into a ditch, but he might have been only injured. So we took a knife from home and we killed him. But why did you choose him? Because he played with us. No other person would have gone up with us up there. Yet he was your buddy. What about them wanting to kill us? His father is a militiaman, and he says we should have our throats cut. But he, the boy, had said nothing to you? Him? No. You know he's dead now? Yes. What is death? It's when it's all over. We go to heaven. Did you kill him? Yes. Does that do anything to you, to have killed someone? No, since they wanted to kill us, so... Does that bother you to be in prison? No. Fanon, 1970, page 195. Over the past millennium, the French, like other Western Europeans, have lived in an environment where the state has a monopoly on violence.
So Europe has had a huge influx of people from Africa and the Middle East, and immigrants for normal, natural, and healthy reasons often have a very strong group identity, and young immigrants often are members of gangs, and they will often beat up on the native European youth who are less likely to belong to gangs and less likely to have a group backing them up.
They are forbidden to act violently and cannot rely on their kinsmen to protect life and property. That's the government's job. In many other societies, however, the state is more recent, often foreign, and generally unreliable. Men are still expected to use violence to defend themselves and their loved ones, and such violence is often organized collectively by brothers, young men of the same clan or extended family. In such societies, your real friends are your brothers. Friendship isn't just about sharing the same recreational activities, it's also about risking your life for your kin. Whites are too individualistic. In another chapter, an African discusses the individualism of white people. Quote, impatience, love of money, individualism, all of these traits define Westerners for Africans. The whites don't stop running. They want to stay ahead of us. We take our time. One day surely they will stop. After all, one cannot run endlessly for centuries. They will understand that 2 or 3 weeks of vacation are not enough for the kind of life they lead. According to Matip, African solidarity is under threat of giving way to the Europeans' every man for himself. In African novels, this counter-discourse is seen in remarks like, "The white man has no friends," or "We aren't whites who couldn't care less about the misfortunes of others."
So when I was in therapy one day, the therapist asked me how close was my family. I said, we're about average for white people, because compared to the Asians and the Jews and other ethnics that I knew, we did not have nearly the intensity of connection that I noticed with other families.
Schipper, 2013, pp at 100, 101. Yet, in some strange way, individualism seems to explain the success of white people. But how? This is a recurrent...
Well, there are circumstances where an individualist strategy is going to be more useful. So if there are big rewards for a unique perspective and for innovation and for the courage to go it alone against communal sanction, then an individualist strategy will reap those big rewards.
Theme of African literature, the desire to find out this secret, along with a feeling that Christianity is a false secret.
So, on the other hand, Northeast Asia, with its long, arduous winters, in all likelihood, it encouraged, through natural selection, the development of much more corporate, unified group outlook on things, much less individualism, right? Because an individualist approach to surviving long, brutal winters probably not as effective as the corporate approach.
An attempt to hide the real one. Quote, "One evening, Father Dumont observed that the Africans, who until then had been converting in great numbers, were now abandoning the faith. His cook Zachariah explained to him, 'The first of us who came rushing to religion, they came as they would to a revelation, the revelation of your secret, the secret of your strength, the strength of your plains, new railways. How can I put it? The secret of your mystery. Instead of that, you began talking to them about God, about the soul, about..."
So Northeast Asian societies tend to have quite low crime rates, high social cohesion, social trust, but they don't innovate, right? They don't create much. That mainly comes from Europeans.
Eternal life and so on. Don't you think they already knew all of that before? Long before you came? Gracious me, they got the impression you were hiding something from them. Schipper, 2013, p. 105. Africans understand how individualism might be a source of strength. Because whites have weaker kinship ties, they have fewer people to share their wealth with. They can invest it as they see fit. But this is not a realistic option in Africa.
Yeah, so when I was 18, I took it for granted that I was on my own, in the sense that it would be up to me to pay for college. On the other hand, this African culture where if you get rich, you're expected to have to share it with everyone who bears any relationship to you, is just completely unfathomable from my experience. So growing up in individualist Anglo culture, there was no sense that if you got rich, you then had to share it with everyone who was genetically close to you.
If you don't share your wealth with tons of brothers and sisters, you'll still end up having to share it, but now with a lot of unfriendly non-relatives. So what is the secret? In the late Middle Ages, the peoples of Northern and Western Europe gradually consolidated into nation-states and began a relentless expansion outward, first within Europe and then beyond, until they dominated the entire world. This domination was most obvious in their creation of colonial empires, but it was also apparent in other areas.
So growing up as an Anglo and then converting to Orthodox Judaism, I noticed that life is much more intense among Jews, that kinship societies produce more intense relationships. And by contrast, Anglo relationships are much more chill.
The economy, science, technology, and so on. So what was the secret of their success? It seemed to suggest something to do with trust, individualism, and Christianity. Many readers here will also shout out intelligence, perhaps. But a number of human groups have reached high levels of cognitive ability, maybe even higher, while failing to achieve the same dominance. Think of the Parsis, the Ashkenazim, and the Chinese. There seem to be several interacting factors, but how do they all fit together? And what brought them together? Was it colonialism, the slave trade, the printing press, the Protestant Reformation? If we look at historical data from Northwest Europe, specifically at growth in GDP per capita for England and Holland, we find that this region began to overtake the rest of the world before any of the above happened, back in the 14th century, Frost 2022a. This trend can be traced back further to the 7th century among the peoples bordering the North Sea. With little prior experience, they took to international trade like Meiji Japan, exchanging not only goods, but also ideas. Analysts gathered information from these merchants, kings used them to pass messages back and forth, and missionaries traveled with them. Milano, 2014. The North Sea traders were able to transcend their ties of kinship and organize new networks within a growing market economy. In this respect, they surpassed other trading peoples for whom a market was simply a marketplace, a small center of trade limited in time and space. Beyond the marketplace, most goods and services were not produced for a wider market. They were produced to meet the needs of one's family or kin group. Those North Sea traders and their descendants would be the first humans to extend the market principle beyond the marketplace and ultimately to society as a whole, thus making kinship obsolete as a means to organize relationships. This trajectory was made possible by a pre-existing tendency toward individualism and weak kinship ties. Specifically, north and west of the Hajnal Line, an imaginary line stretching from Trieste to St. Petersburg, humans have exhibited certain behavioral tendencies for at least the past millennium, living alone for at least part of adulthood, with many individuals remaining single their entire lives, leaving the nuclear family upon reaching adulthood either to form new households or to circulate among unrelated households, typically as servants, showing greater individualism, less loyalty to kin.
So when I was younger, I put much more emphasis on friends than family. I thought, wow, friends are great. I can go out and create the type of relationships that I want. But then as I've aged, I realized that friends need a lot more upkeep than your relationships with family. Like, I think I went about 14 years without seeing my brother, but then we just picked up, right where we left off.
And greater willingness to trust strangers. Being inclined toward impersonal prosociality, that is, social interaction that is less emotionally intense while encompassing a larger number of people. Schultz et al. 2019. See also Frost, 2017, Frost, 2020, Hajnal, 1965, Hartman, 2004, HBD * Chick, 2014, ICA, 2020, McDonald, 2019, Seckham, 1992, P. 94, 95.
And I assume that's Kevin McDonald who's
150, 153, 184, 190. The above points are widely accepted. Some authors, Frost, HBD * Chick, McDonald, Schultz, have gone on to argue that these behavioral tendencies explain why the market economy and the state arose earlier in Northwest Europe than elsewhere. If people are less bound by kinship, they can more easily organize their social and economic relationships in other ways. To varying degrees, the above authors have also argued that impersonal prosociality is supported by a certain mindset: moral universalism and moral absolutism. Rules are followed and enforced more willingly if framed in universal and absolute terms, as opposed to the situational and relativistic rule framing of kinship networks. Moralized perception of non-kin.
Right. So I grew up taking universal morality for granted, and I thought that tribal morality was incredibly primitive. And then I got older and older and realized that most of the world practices dual morality, right? One morality for one's in-group, much more less demanding morality for out-groups. So almost all the world, except essentially for people from Northern Europe, practice dual morality. Only people from Northern Europe tend towards practicing universal morality.
Help is more willingly provided to non-kin as long as they belong to the community of rule followers. Continual rule breaking leads to expulsion from the community. Insiders are thus separated from outsiders by a line dividing the morally worthy from the morally worthless. Guilt activation. Rule breaking is punished more through internal activation of guilt than through external activation of shame. Guilt is the distress felt by a rule breaker even when the rule breaking is witnessed by no one else. Conversely, shame causes distress only when the rule breaking is witnessed by someone else. Benedict, 1946. Broader range of targets for effective empathy. Effective empathy is extended from the mother-child relationship to all social relationships. Through this involuntary transfer of another person's feelings to oneself, rule breaking is experienced as harm, not only to the victim, but also to oneself.
So in the individualist Anglo culture that I grew up in Australia and in California, all right, it was unfathomable to be an outlaw and still retain any kind of self-esteem. You were just raised and accepted that you should obey the law, that you should not cheat outsiders, that you should always conduct yourself honorably.
Some researchers have argued that effective empathy and guilt are two overlapping aspects of the same mental mechanism. This mental behavioral package is attributed by some authors to Western Christianity, Schultz, HBD** Chick, and by others to earlier forms of social organization, Frost, MacDonald. According to the first scenario, the Western Church diverged from the Eastern churches by imposing an extreme ban on cousin marriages, which resulted in weaker kinship ties, less clannishness, and eventually much more individualism. Previously, Roman civil law had banned only first cousin marriages. The Western Church extended the ban 2 degrees further in the 7th century by adopting the anti-incest prohibitions of the Visigothic Code. Then, in the early 9th century, it began to calculate degrees of kinship differently by adopting the so-called Germanic system, thereby doubling the number of forbidden marriage partners. The extreme ban on cousin marriages thus seems to have come from norms that already existed among Northwest Europeans.
Right, so by banning cousin marriage, it encourages higher IQ because extensive inbreeding has a negative effect on intelligence.
Particularly the Germanic tribes. Frost, 2020, McCann, 2010, pp. 57, 58. Those norms were certainly promoted and enforced more effectively by the Church, but their origins go back further. Frost, 2020, see also Tensor, 2021. In the 9th century, when the extreme ban on cousin marriages was being introduced, French households were already small and nuclear, with 12% to 16% of adults being unmarried, and with adults usually marrying in their mid to late 20s. Hallam, 1985, p. 56, Secom, 1992, p. 94. As for earlier times, we cannot draw firm conclusions.
So when I was growing up as a Seventh-day Adventist, which is a modern form of Puritanism, generally speaking, people waited until they got married before they had sex, among those with an intense commitment to the religion.
From available evidence, which is fragmentary and mostly concerns elite males with young brides. A high level of individualism is indicated by a tendency to postpone marriage long after puberty, as noted by Julius Caesar and Tacitus among the Germanic tribes. Quote, "Those who have remained chaste for the longest time receive the greatest commendation among their people. They think that by this the growth is promoted, By this, the physical powers are increased and the sinews are strengthened. And to have had knowledge of a woman before the 20th year, they reckon among the most disgraceful acts. Caesar de Bello Gallico 6. 21 late comes love to the young men, and their first manhood is not enfeebled, nor for the girls is there any hothouse forcing. They pass their youth in the same way as the boys. Tacitus, Germania 20.
Right, that's very different from traditional Jewish culture where people were encouraged to marry much earlier than that, like by the late teens, early 20s.
We now come to the second scenario, which postulates that this mental behavioral package emerged before Christianity, specifically in post-glacial times among the fishing peoples of the North Sea and the Baltic. Those humans differed from other hunter-gatherers by forming large, semi-sedentary coastal communities thanks to an abundant food supply of fish, seals and shellfish, price 1991. They thus had to solve the large society problem at an earlier date, and not necessarily in the same way as other peoples would. Perhaps they reduced clannishness by discouraging cousin marriages and by imposing the same universal rules on all community members. This cultural evolution would have provided a template for genetic evolution, by favoring those who could more readily internalize universal rules and feel effective empathy in all social relationships.
Right, this is Peter Frost. He's an anthropologist in Canada. Right, Donald Trump was asked about his relationship with God.
This is Sharon from Alabama, and I think her question actually ties into what we were just talking about. How do you do this? And I know that you've said before that you've been sustained by the prayers of lots of Americans. I've seen pictures of people praying over you.
It's incredible, actually.
Her question is, she says, you've been faced with so much adversity and persecution for years. What's your relationship with God like, and how do you pray? That's Sharon from Alabama.
Okay, so I think it's good. I do very well with the evangelicals. I love the evangelicals. And I have more people saying they pray for me. I can't even believe it. And they are so committed, and they're so believing. They say, "Sir, you're going to be okay. I pray for you every night." I mean, everybody, almost, I can't say everybody, but almost everybody that sees me, they say it. It's such a beautiful thing. You know what's a beautiful thing, too? When you look at all of this bad stuff going on, they have nothing to look up to. They have no God. They have no anything. They kill people, they beat people, they push people into subways. There's just nothing there. Religion is such a great thing. It keeps you, there's something to be good about. You want to be good. It's so important, and I don't know if it's explained right. I don't know if I'm explaining it right now, but when you have something like that, you want to be good. You want to go to heaven, okay? You want to go to heaven. If you don't have heaven, you almost say, what's the reason? Yeah. Why do I have to be good? Let's not be good. What difference does it make? Right?
Or they try to create heaven here.
This is Sharon.
Okay, so Joe Biden seems to be increasingly modeling his administration on Donald Trump's platform, which is amusing, right? He's now trying to beef up enforcement at the border. He's followed Donald Trump's trade policies and taken them even further in a nationalist direction.
Biden's border election gambit. He finally takes some action with an executive order, but voters will wonder if he means it. By the editorial board. June 4th, 2024.
Wall Street Journal.
5:57 p.m. Eastern Time. What do you know? More than 3 years into his presidency, Joe Biden has discovered the border mess. On Tuesday, he announced executive actions that he claims will stem a tidal wave of migrants. This looks like a tactical political retreat masquerading as a battle cry. Polls show that the border has moved to the top of voter concerns, and a significant majority believe Donald Trump would do a better job handling it. Perhaps because he did. Encounters along the U.S.-Mexico border have nearly tripled since 2019, and they've increased more than sixfold since 2018. See the nearby chart, which makes the point in one lesson. Even Democrats who run big cities say they're overwhelmed by migrants. Yet the administration until Tuesday ignored their pleas for help while picking a fight with Texas Governor Greg Abbott over his efforts to protect the border. Now with Mr. Trump hammering the issue, Mr. Biden knows he must at least appear to be doing something. Thus his executive order on Tuesday that would supposedly block migrants seeking asylum at the southern border when the average number of daily encounters between ports of entry hits 2,500 over a week. The border could reopen once the daily average declines to 1,500. Daily encounters this year have averaged about 6,000. Mr. Biden's executive actions might help reduce the flow somewhat if they are strictly enforced, and at least he's admitting the problem. But the press release sounds better than the details. Migrants could still seek asylum at ports of entry using the CBP One mobile app, which would be excluded from the daily triggers. A White House fact sheet says the order also exempts migrants if they faced an imminent and extreme threat to life or safety, such as an imminent threat of rape, kidnapping, torture, or murder. This sounds much like the way the dysfunctional asylum system currently works. Unaccompanied minors aren't covered by the order, which might encourage more of them to seek asylum. Mr. Biden's order is sure to be challenged in court, as the ACLU has already promised. It's no small irony that the president invokes the same legal authority under the Immigration and Nationality Act that Mr. Trump used to impose his travel ban.
Okay, so Washington Post has an article here that a black representative, Republican Byron Donalds, campaigning for Donald Trump, argued that black families were stronger during the Jim Crow era. Well, of course they were.
This news story was written by Patrick Svitek, Donalds, Republican Florida, campaigning Tuesday for former President Donald Trump, argued black families were stronger during the Jim Crow era, drawing vocal condemnation from Democrats, including House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries.
But nowhere in the story do they investigate or use any evidence about whether or not black families actually were stronger. And the evidence is overwhelming that black families were stronger during Jim Crow. But the facts of the comment don't get any consideration in this Washington Post piece.
Democrat New York. Donalds, who has been mentioned as a possible running mate for Trump, made the comments at a Trump campaign event in Philadelphia with Representative Wesley Hunt, Republican Texas. That was aimed at black voters. Donalds and Hunt are both black. The Philadelphia Inquirer quoted Donalds as saying he was beginning to see the reinvigoration of black family in America, and suggesting that black family values had been in decline since black voters embraced the Democratic Party after the Civil Rights Movement. You see,
so the media just seized on this, right? They just had an absolute field day, and Democrats were seizing on it as well because it's a weapon.
The so-called leader has made
Trump.
The factually inaccurate statement that black
Hakeem
folks
Jeffries.
were better off during Jim Crow. That's an outlandish, outrageous, and out-of-pocket observation.
No, he said that the black family was stronger, and the evidence is overwhelming that it was.
We were not better off when a young boy named Emmett Till could be brutally murdered without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when black women could be sexually assaulted without consequence.
Okay, so what are the facts on the ground? Walter Williams wrote about this.
Growing up in the Richard Allen Housing Project of North Philadelphia, when Emmett Till was lynched in Money, Mississippi, on August 28, 1955, and his brutalized, unrecognizable body later recovered from the Tallahatchie River. From 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the... Just a quick word from our sponsor.
Oh, come on.
It's time for today's Lucky Land horoscope.
Oh, bloody hell. Okay, I guess I can mute and let them play the ad. But anyway, he makes the point that out-of-wedlock birth rate among blacks in 1940 was 11%. Today, it is 75%. Obviously, the black family was stronger during Jim Crow. Black female-headed households were just 18% of black households in 1950 as opposed to 68% today. So from 1890 to 1940, the black marriage rate was higher than that of whites, right? Most black children lived in biological two-parent families, right? There's a dramatic difference.
Political hustlers like to blame poverty and racism while ignoring the fact that poverty and racism were much greater yesteryear, but there was not nearly the same amount of chaos. The out-of-wedlock birth rate among blacks in 1940 was about 11%. Today, it is 75%. Black female-headed households were just 18% of households in 1950, as opposed to about 68% today. In fact, from 1890 to 1940, the black marriage rate was slightly higher than that of whites. Even during slavery, when marriage was forbidden, most black children lived in biological two-parent families. In New York City in 1925, 85% of black households were two-parent households. A study of 1880 family structure in Philadelphia shows that 3/4 of black families were two-parent households. There's little protest against the horrible and dangerous conditions under which many poor and law-abiding black people must live. It is not uncommon for 50 black people to be shot over a weekend in Chicago, not by policemen but...
So if the Washington Post and the elite media investigated the reality of the statistics regarding the black family, all right, it was obviously much stronger back in the 1950s, 1940s under Jim Crow than it's been since the 1980s. Right,
America, Joe Biden's campaign is lying to you once again, and they're gaslighting. Now they're trying to say that I said black people were doing better under Jim Crow. I never said that. They are lying.
How's everybody doing? My name is Anthony Brian Logan, and today we got to talk about our good brother, the Republican House rep from Florida, Byron Donalds, being misrepresented by the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who, of course, is a Democrat. Now, we're going to get into the official quote later, but a brief summary is that Byron Donalds said the black family was more cohesive, more together, and more conservative during the period of Jim Crow in the US of A. And if you don't know what that is, basically, this was a period of time prior to 1960, after slavery, where there were certain laws in the books to enforce segregation by race. Okay, if you're a black person, you got to use that water fountain or have that part of the bus or that part of...
Okay, facts on the ground. Black family was much stronger in America during Jim Crow. Right, critical race theory. Maybe you've heard a little bit about it.
Dr. Delgado's anti-white scholarship. Critical race theory has been hugely influential in American education. Few realize its potential for causing anti-white violence. Written by James Whites.
Whoa, Glib Medley is joining the chat from X.
Richard Delgado is a
Saying
Mexican-American
naughty words.
legal scholar who co-founded critical race theory, CRT, in the 1970s as a legal activist framework for achieving a cultural Marxist transformation of Western civilization. He and other CRT scholars cultivated an obsessive focus on racial grievances in order to re-evaluate the foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. In his highly influential career, he has become the 8th most cited legal scholar in U.S. history and has authored 180 journal articles and dozens of books. This essay gives a broad overview of the irrational anti-white ideas from Delgado's book and related writings, which continue to gain currency despite their deceptive, contradictory, and inept argumentation. On p. 156 of his book, Critical Race Theory, an introduction which is described as a primer for non-lawyers, he envisions an inevitable power shift in the United States. Quote, "The white establishment may resist an orderly progression towards sharing power, particularly in connection with upper-level and technical..."
Okay, so this guy, Richard Delgado, all right, he published a book, The Coming Race War, and Other Apocalyptic Tales of America After Affirmative Action and Welfare. The Coming Race War. I mean, he's stoking it. He's looking forward to it.
Jobs, police agencies, and government. As happened in South Africa, the change may be convulsive and cataclysmic. If so, critical theorists and activists will need to provide criminal defense for resistance movements and activists and to articulate theories and strategies for that resistance." End quote. This vaguely worded passage envisions white people resisting an orderly progression towards sharing power. Delgado cannot but know that for more than 50 years, white people have been participating in an orderly sharing of power through racial preference programs that flout the plain meaning of the Constitution. What then would qualify as white resistance to this unlawful but orderly sharing of power? Perhaps a series of Supreme Court rulings banning racial preference programs, state laws banning DEI programs in public universities, followed by whatever measures are required to safeguard these newfound freedoms. This would seem to be Delgado's intended meaning. After all, he does not say that there would be anything criminal about the white resistance, reserving that term only for his own side. Indeed, a close reading of the passage reveals that it is advocating two things. One, that CRT activists come up with strategies of unlawful counter-resistance, and two, that lawyers create legal theories and strategies to defend activists who carry out the resulting crimes. It goes without saying that all defendants are constitutionally entitled to legal representation. But when Delgado's impressionable young readership in high schools, colleges, and law schools see a scholar of his stature exhorting them to plan and commit crimes, it is foreseeable that they will indeed be emboldened to engage in criminal activism.
Okay, so Richard Delgado is on the faculty of the law school. I think is it Seattle Law School?
Lines. This country has a very great wealth gap with a surprising percentage of families in poverty, so that the lawyers who are prepared to perform legal services for the poor are in demand. Many of our graduates from this school find work in that area, in poverty law, immigration practice, writing wills for Indians on Indian reservations. And a student who's interested in public interest law, serving the poor or minority populations, will find many students of like mind. They'll find a cadre of professors who are national experts in the law of the poor, Indian law. They'll of course find strong instruction in corporate law, tax, civil procedure, all the standard law school courses. But someone who's interested in learning how to apply legal tools to the problems of disenfranchised groups will find plenty of that emphasis at this law school.
All right, that's the Richard Delgado, who is the focus of this piece in Aporia magazine.
As I explained here, when the revolution comes, the crime that Delgado himself will have committed by encouraging others to commit crimes in response to lawful white resistance to a decades-long unconstitutional power grab is called aiding and abetting. But what sorts of crimes does he have in mind? Would they include violence, for example? Delgado is holding this close to his chest, though the reference to South Africa, where CRT-inspired violence against white Boer farmers has been in the 6th stage of genocide since at least 2021, might be a hint. In the land of Shaka Zulu, genocide...
Have you heard about critical race theory? I'm guessing you probably have. It has already insinuated itself into many institutions and is making rapid progress into others. If it takes hold, it will completely change the very nature of America and the way you live. Critical race theory holds that the most important thing about you is your race. The color of your skin, that's who you are.
Well, sometimes it is. All right, I'm not someone who's just automatically opposed to critical race theory. Obviously, if it's used to whip up needless hatred, then I think it's stupid. But sometimes the most important thing about you is your race. Sometimes the most important thing about you is your citizenship. Another time, the most important thing about you is which football team you support. Another time, the most important thing about you is your profession or where you went to college.
Not your behavior, not your
values.
values, not your environment.
Yeah, in different situations, all right, different identities will come to the fore. So far, this is a moronic critique.
Your race. In critical race theory, if you are a member of a minoritized racial group, their term, not mine, you are a victim of a system that is rigged against you, a system that doesn't want you to succeed. On the other hand, if your race is privileged, you're an exploiter, whether you intend to be or not. Critical race theory begins from the assumption that racism occurs in all interactions. To see how this works, consider this thought experiment. Imagine you own a shop and two customers enter at the same time, one white and one black. Who do you help first? If you help the black person first, critical race theory would say you did so because you don't trust black people to be left alone in your store. That's racist. If you help the white person first instead, critical race theory would say you did so because you think blacks are second-class citizens. That's racist too. That's critical race theory. It can find racism in anything, even if it has to read your mind to do it. Critical race theory is a...
Right, so various critical theories will take, different angles, right? So if you're an economist, you're going to look at things through a lens of economics. I worked for years in landscaping, so when I see a garden, when I see a yard, one of the first things I think about is how is it going to drain when the water flows through or when it rains. So I've been influenced by the work that I've done. So lawyers will look at the world through a legal lens. There's nothing inherently moronic or evil about looking at all sorts of issues through a racial or a religious or a professional or an economic or a social lens or a psychological lens.
Uniquely American invention. Brewed up at Harvard Law School in the 70s, now part of the academic and media mainstream, it is also uniquely un-American because it rejects the core tenets of the American, classically liberal Judeo-Christian value system.
There were times and places in America where racial identity was much more important than it is today.
It turns the bedrock American idea upside down. Here it is in the words of Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, two leading proponents. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism.
Right, there are good reasons to question the basis of the liberal order. In many situations, the liberal order is a great way to go. I'm grateful for our legal protections in this liberal country. But there are going to be other situations where a different system will be more advantageous. And if you persist in an ineffective system, all right, you'll be at a competitive disadvantage and you may not even survive to pass on your genes. So different political systems and different theories work, differently depending on the situation.
And the neutral principles of constitutional law. It does this because critical race theory proponents assume racism is present everywhere and always, and they look.
Okay, and economists have their own assumptions, and Christians and theologians and experts in Jewish law have their own assumptions. Now, you're probably wondering, 40, is fascism right or left? And who better to talk about it than Dinesh D'Souza?
He's a fascist. For decades, this has been a favorite smear of the left aimed at those on the right. Every Republican president, for that matter, virtually every Republican, since the 1970s has been called a fascist, now more than ever. This label is based on the idea that fascism is a phenomenon of the political right. The left says it is, and some self-styled white supremacists and neo-Nazis embrace the label. But are they correct? To answer this question, we have to ask what fascism really means. What is its underlying ideology? Where does it even come from? These are not easy questions to answer. We know the name of the philosopher of capitalism, Adam Smith. We know the name of the philosopher of Marxism, Karl Marx. But who's the philosopher of fascism? Yes, exactly. You don't know. Don't feel bad. Almost no one knows. This is not because he doesn't exist, but because historians, most of whom are on the political left, had to erase him from history in order to avoid confronting fascism's actual beliefs. So let me introduce him to you. His name is Giovanni Gentile.
I mean, this guy is so ignorant, I can't stand to play another second. But the distributor of his awful, awful film, 2000 Mules, has been forced to pay a settlement.
Big story that broke late Friday that got lost in all the Trump trial coverage. Salem Media Group, a conservative media giant, just issued an apology and retraction of the highly promoted and debunked Dinesh D'Souza documentary 2000 Mules, which the company co-produced. The movie that had been debunked again and again claimed it had proof that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, and they were insistent that the film proved it.
They have ruined Election Day in the United States of America. That's provable. And that's enough for me to fight the left with every fiber in my body.
Without free and fair elections, we are not a democracy. We are a criminal cartel.
So I don't see a problem with mail-in ballots. I don't see sufficient evidence that mail-in ballots are less trustworthy than other type of ballots. So I do think that the Democrats played the game more effectively with Republicans with regard to voting laws. But I don't believe that there was anything like the criminal voter fraud alleged by this ridiculous Dinesh D'Souza documentary.
Masquerading as a democracy.
But it wasn't provable. It was repeatedly disproven, but the movie was put out on Salem Media's websites and channels for years. It's been quoted endlessly by many on the far right. It got a big Mar-a-Lago premiere filled with far-right celebrities, regularly pushed, of course, by Donald Trump, who issued a presidential pardon for D'Souza on a separate matter.
You have to watch the movie next week, Dinesh D'Souza. And they have people stuffing the boxes like you've never seen before.
I hope that you've seen 2,000 Mules. I would like to investigate if any of that is provable.
Look at the 2,000 Mules. So if you're able to prove any of this, right, you'd be set for life. Let's say 40 found evidence for some of these wild claims in 2,000 Mules. I'd be set for life. I'd become a millionaire. I'd be able to go around lecturing to Republican groups and earning enormous amounts of money. I would become, famous beyond my wildest dreams. I would have, access to all sorts of pretty young women if I was able to come forward with evidence that the 2020 election was rigged. Right? There are such enormous rewards possible for anyone who can coherently, empirically make that case, and yet nobody can.
Mules documentary that has come out. Look at how many mass mail-out ballots there were across the United States for which we have no security.
I think you do want to ask him, but you don't want to ask about 2,000 mules. I'm really appalled.
There's another kind of mule now in America, and it is the title of my Salem colleague Dinesh D'Souza's new movie, 2,000 Mules, and it's shocking.
Our new documentary film, 2,000 Mules. Let me tell you, folks. What I saw in this movie is mind-blowing.
And I still have people, friends of mine, go, oh, there's no way that Donald Trump can win because the Democrats are just going to steal the election again. And when I say, well, where's the evidence that they stole the 2000 election? Oh, there's this video where they were taking ballots and putting them in a box. It was like clearly fraudulent. But, every one of these wild accusations falls apart upon examination.
We're talking about proof here.
Right, very early after the 2020 election, right, I dug into voter fraud, spent hours and hours, 20 hours, reading books and academic papers on it, and I said there's just no evidence that there was substantial amounts of voter fraud. Obviously, in an election with over 100 million people voting, there's going to be some voter fraud, but it was very clear to me that there was no evidence that there was substantial enough voter fraud to swing the presidential results or any major electoral results in the 2020 election. And as more time has gone by since I made that argument completely against the grain of people who watch me regularly, right, the evidence just piles up more and more on the side that there is no evidence for substantial voter fraud in the 2020 election.
Talking about facts that you can't dispute.
Well, apparently you can. And now Salem has issued an apology, specifically after they were sued by a Georgia man named Mark Andrews, who was accused of criminal activity in the film, but cleared by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Salem writing that they, quote, relied on representations made to us by Dinesh D'Souza and True the Vote, and they apologized for the hurt caused by
the quality of right-wing discourse, right-wing media is just really low. It's just moronic. It's just reckless. It's just, endless tales of victimization. It's funded by all these bogus supplements and ridiculous gold and silver schemes that work, against the detriment of the people who buy into the ads that fund conservative media.
The film, there will be no future distribution of the film or the book by Salem, basically throwing True the Vote and D'Souza under the bus, undermining not just the film's claims, but True the Vote and D'Souza's entire premise. It's actually a very significant development because this film has been cited so often. Joining us now is Farron Cousins. He is the co-host of Ring of Fire podcast. He's been an outspoken critic of 2000.
So it's so tempting to just buy into the BS when it supports your side. But Dinesh
Hello,
D'Souza,
everyone. I'm JVL.
Consistently puts out crap.
Here with the Mistress of Darkness, AB Stoddard, and everything is terrible. It's Monday, June 3. Donald Trump never said, lock her up. Apparently, we all just mass hallucinated it. Lara Trump is going after the Republican Senate candidate from the state of Maryland. 2000 Mules, the book/movie that made it's been retracted. Everyone's just gonna be like, nope, that thing was all wrong. No prices to be paid. Nobody at Salem Media, none of their radio hosts are resigning their posts because they've been shamed by the behavior of their employees. Where do you want to start today, AB? Because truly, everything is terrible.
Yes, it's very bleak. Well, let's start with 2000 Mules. I mean, this is not as shocking as Fox News having to pay out almost $1 billion for their lies, but it is consequential. It's pretty significant, and it's the idea that we live in a time where there's no accountability, and then we have people living in information ecosystems, so that Fox viewers never really found out about the Dominion lawsuit, and that their own
Fox viewers never realized that their network had just paid out $800 million.
Had lied and paid for it, and they had been flat out busted and paid like this epic historical sum. And so I don't know what Salem's doing, but I'm just stunned that we are. I mean, it makes me so happy that people sue.
So Salem's an evangelical Christian business. You might naively think that they hold themselves accountable to a higher law. Not so much.
These people and take them to the cleaners, and it actually works. And in open court, there is an objective truth that exists, just like every partisan who has to go into a doctor's office and listen to news about cancer focuses on objective truth, but refuses to in their media consumption. This is vindication. It's just like you actually wrote about last week. Like, the rule of law works, the justice system functions. All the lies are rooted out in court, and that makes me happy. It's just that out in our society, then there's no price to pay anymore for lying that way and being held to account.
This
for
news
it. So
story was written by
legally.
Miriam Berger. Israeli detention center faces legal challenge after unimaginable abuses. Jerusalem. Israel is transferring hundreds of Gazan inmates out of SDE Timon, a shadowy military-run detention center in Israel's southern desert that former prisoners and whistleblowers have alleged was a site of grave human rights abuses. Israeli authorities announced that they had begun transferring detainees to other facilities in response to a hearing held by the country's Supreme Court on Wednesday, the first to challenge the legality of SDE Timon. It was the latest move by rights groups to shed light on what they say is a legal black hole created after October 7th, allowing prisoners from Gaza to disappear into military custody.
Okay, so prisoners from Gaza are not Israeli citizens, ergo they have no rights, right? There's only one entity that can enforce and protect your rights. That is the state. Right? People in Gaza are not citizens of Israel, ergo they have no rights in Israel. All right, what's going on with Jeffrey Epstein accusers?
Psychiatrist Henry Jarecki says relationship with Epstein accuser was consensual. Woman filed lawsuit Monday accusing Jarecki of sexual abuse after Epstein sent her to him for treatment. By Khadija Safter. June 5th, 2024. 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Famed psychiatrist Henry Jarecki said he had a consensual relationship with a woman who has filed a lawsuit accusing him of sexual assault after she was sent to him for treatment by Jeffrey Epstein. False accusations have been made against me by lawyers seeking money on behalf of a woman with whom I had a consensual, non-secretive, and mutually respectful relationship over a decade ago, when she was a successful professional in her late 20s, Jarecki said in a statement Wednesday. On Monday, the unnamed woman filed a lawsuit in Manhattan federal court accusing Jarecki, who is 91 years old, of raping her repeatedly from 2011 to 2014. She alleges that Epstein introduced her to Jarecki for mental.
So he would have been 80 years of age and she was in her 20s. And she came to him via Jeffrey Epstein for psychological counseling.
mental health treatment, and instead of helping her, Jarecki sexually abused her. Dr. Jarecki's defense is, in context, nothing short of an admission. His attack on the lawyer's attempts to deflect from his admission. "We will let him explain it to a jury one day," said Brad Edwards, a lawyer for the woman and other Epstein accusers. The lawsuit alleges that Epstein sent many of his victims to Jarecki to treat depression, and that the psychiatrist shielded Epstein from law enforcement, prescribed the women medication, and discussed their confidential medical information with Epstein. It also alleges that Jarecki used his friendship with Epstein to obtain young females from him and sexually abuse them himself. In his statement Wednesday, Jarecki said, "I have never engaged in any abusive conduct with her or anyone else. I will contest these demonstrably untrue claims in the appropriate forum." Jarecki's lawyer had previously said the allegations were false. The psychiatrist was listed in Epstein's now public address book and in flight logs of Epstein's private planes, but his dealings with the convicted sex offender, who died in 2019, weren't previously public. Jarecki is known as a wealthy commodities trader and entrepreneur, as well as a longtime faculty member at Yale University, where
Okay, nationalism, big threat to the ruling liberal elites. This is Martin Wolf here, writing in the Financial Times.
By Martin Wolf. I have a nightmare. The next US president declares that his country no longer stands by its commitment, under the NATO treaty, to come to the defense of a member. The Europeans fail to put together a credible replacement. Fearful of the threat from a revanchist Russia, a number switch their allegiance to Russia and China. Europe dissolves. Is this plausible? I hope not. Yet behind the nightmare is reality. We are entering a period of resurgent nationalism, xenophobia, and authoritarianism. As Oscar Wilde might have remarked, to elect Donald Trump as president once may be regarded as a misfortune. To elect him twice looks like carelessness. His return would indicate something very disturbing about the state of the West's superpower. The Brookings Institution's Robert Kagan notes in a podcast with me that Trump's proximity to power is due to potent anti-liberal forces. The implications of such attitudes for U.S. democracy are worrying. But that worry is not limited to the domestic. Trump's America First was a slogan used by the aviator Charles Lindbergh in opposition to U.S. support for Britain in the Second World War. This opposition only ended after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 forced the U.S. into war. Lindbergh was an isolationist. To the extent that he can be defined, Trump is an unreliable unilateralist.
So democracy is under threat, but when you give people what they want, all right, which is nationalism, all right, that's a threat. So you really can't have it both ways. The reason that alternatives to the liberal world order are being invoked right now is because regular people don't see the liberal world order as operating in their own best interests, right? The United States has no rational reason to be in NATO, right? It's against the average American's best interest that the U.S. is in NATO. It's against the average American's best interest. The U.S. is so deeply involved in Gaza, right? We built a pier in Gaza, P-I-E-R, that fell apart with a few ocean waves, right? We've wasted about $300 million on a completely useless pier in Gaza, which is just kind of representative of the overall fecklessness of American foreign policy trying to uphold this liberal world order.
But, in the context of Russia's ongoing war on Ukraine, this may not be a crucial difference. Would he help, or would he see it as a quarrel in a faraway country, between people of whom we know nothing, in the notorious words of Neville Chamberlain on Czechoslovakia in 1938? For over a century, European security has depended on the U.S. presence. After the First World War, alas.
Well, maybe Europeans should be forced to stand on their own 2 feet. All right, when you subsidize people, you get bad behavior.
The Senate repudiated the League of Nations, and so the U.S. withdrew. That led to the re-emergence of Germany as the dominant military power in the continent, and so to the Second World War. Happily, the U.S. remained engaged in the post-war era. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it might have credibly believed that it should withdraw once again. But now, after Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, that cannot be the case.
Unprovoked, we marched NATO right up to Russia's borders. right? And Russia was protesting for at least 15 years. I mean, we started admitting new nations into NATO from Eastern Europe in 1990. So we were threatening Russia with NATO expansion for about 25 years. No wonder they have punched back. But again, it makes absolutely no difference to the quality of life for Americans who rules Ukraine.
Also increasingly seen by the US as a threat, is providing strong moral and practical support to Russia, including dual-use goods valuable to the prosecution of its war. Again, that justifies engagement.
Yeah, and why is China siding with Russia? Because China and Russia have a common interest. They've got a common enemy, right? We have pushed Russia into the arms of China, right? We have incentivized our two greatest rivals to join forces through our shoddy foreign policy.
Would Trump do? That might soon be a relevant question. The collapse of the US-led security order in Europe would have global repercussions. The defeat of Ukraine would surely encourage China vis-a-vis Taiwan. But beyond that,
it wouldn't do anything to China's calculation vis-a-vis Taiwan. All right, China's going to attack Taiwan if it sees that as in its best interest. All right, wars are fought because different sides don't have the same estimation of power. Right, wars are fought to settle arguments. Right, if all sides were agreed on how much military force each side has, there wouldn't be a war. But because different sides see different capabilities, right, and they see an opportunity to seize their own self-interest, right, then they go to war. It's not because of what happens 5,000 miles away in a completely unrelated conflict. The only thing that it has in common is the United States is sucked in, just like the United States is sucked in the Middle East against its own best interests.
Doubts about security guarantees in Europe would have implications for their credibility for Japan, South Korea, Australia, or New Zealand. All over Asia, countries would try to get closer to China. Alas, the EU, too, is threatened by nationalists.
Yeah, countries will try to get closer to China if that's in their self-interest, right? If making deals with China works more to your national self-interest, people do that. But China's got almost no allies. Why does China have almost no allies? Because overwhelmingly, countries don't see it as in their best interest to ally with China. Instead, they overwhelmingly ally with the United States. China is surrounded by enemies who, by and large, have found a modus vivendi with the United States to discourage the rise of China.
Xenophobes and authoritarians within. Parties with these attitudes are expected to expand their presence substantially in the European parliamentary elections. In time, more of them are expected to achieve power.
Yeah, and why are they rising to power? Because they are seen as better at meeting the needs of the citizens of the countries that vote for them. Right? There's not an inevitability that a liberal left system is the very best system in all circumstances for meeting human needs.
Marine Le Pen might even be the next president of France. When one thinks of the difficulties created just by the Putinism of Viktor Orban, prospects are grim. Nationalism is also reflected in the turning away from liberal trade.
How on earth is Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, like Putin? I mean, what kind of mindset? Remember how there's all this talk in the news media for years about how India was losing its democracy, that it was being run by a intolerant, hierarchical, authoritarian Hindu nationalism. Well, now we've had these massive election results in India, and the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party received quite meager returns, right? It can't rule as a dominant majority anymore. So for years we heard that India's democracy was imperiled. Well, India's democracy spoke back and seems quite alive and well.
Across the world, Trump played a leading role in legitimizing protectionism in his period of office. Biden has followed suit. The present suspicion of trade has many causes. Rising competition from China in manufacturing.
How about the real wages of people with low education in the United States have essentially been stuck for 50 years, and Donald Trump was the first American leader who was able to raise them through, in part, his more protectionist trade policies. Okay.